So the last few videos have focused on the Great Reset as a whole, rather than about Tartaria's specific legacy. Today, we're going to correct that. Today, we're going to talk about the Tartarian Empire's reclassification from an empire to a region. We're going to talk about the so-called Golden Horde and their alliance with the Ottoman Empire against the Papacy under the Ilkhanate. We're also going to talk about Genghis Khan's specific legacy and cite official CIA documents which prove, beyond the shadow of a doubt, that the theory of Great Tartaria is not only plausible, but has been deliberately covered up by our ruling class. Let's get right into it. What is Tartaria? Tartaria, or the Tartarian Empire, was a term that was commonly used by historians and book writers up until around the 18th century. It was used to describe a civilization that existed in northern Eurasia that we commonly refer to today as the Mongol Empire. This empire was presided over by the Khan dynasty, most famously with Genghis Khan, whose reign ended around the early 13th century. We are told by mainstream historians that, shortly after Genghis, the Mongol Empire fell into disarray, descending into the so-called Golden Horde. This narrative tells us that the Horde consisted of loosely organized tribes of Mongol barbarians with no unified culture or centralized leadership. However, this is where the mainstream narrative starts to unravel, because we know the empire didn't fall immediately after Genghis. It maintained and even expanded its territory for centuries thereafter, and this is precisely where, in my opinion, we start to see some manipulation happening with regard to how our history is written about the civilization in particular. Around the 18th century, the term Tartaria began to be reclassified as a region, rather than as a nation or a country, and the term Tartarian Empire was essentially eliminated and replaced rather brutishly by the phrase barbarians, or the Golden Horde. These are still currently being used as blanket terms to this day by contemporary historians to describe essentially all of Tartarian reign from the 13th to 16th centuries. And when examining this matter, I find myself asking, do I really think any civilization would refer to themselves as a horde? Horde, of course, is a derogatory term. Why on earth would they refer to themselves this way? And the only answer I can find is that they didn't call themselves this. They never did. The Golden Horde was a phrase Christian nations labeled the Tartarians as an insult, to diminish and degrade them. In reality, this horde called themselves the Tartarians, and they were part of a very powerful civilization, an empire that has been intentionally obscured from our collective memory. What do we know about this civilization? We are told by historians today that the Golden Horde consisted of four major regions: the Tartar Khanate, the Chagatai Khanate, the Ilkhanate, and the Yuan dynasty in China. What they don't tell us in the mainstream narrative is that these regions together made up the Tartarian Empire. This empire was widely Muslim, though they were known to be accepting of other religions as well. They did elect kings and centralized leadership. This is actually very well documented in texts from this time period, and they had a very powerful military. The Tartarians began losing power and regional control around the 15th century, culminating with the 1480 stand at Ugar River, which resulted in the Tartarians' retreat from Moscow. From that point forward until this very day, Russia has held control of the city. What becomes incredibly clear the more we look into this story is that the Tartarians were not a horde of barbarians at all. They were a nation with a sophisticated military. Otherwise, it would have been impossible for them to hold Moscow for so long. They also ruled over China until 1368 under the Yuan dynasty, as well as Iraq and Iran under the Ilkhanate, with the Ottomans until the mid-14th century. Before we get into specific details and evidence, I just want you skeptics out there to listen closely to this part. We know historical cover-ups have happened time and time again throughout history. To name a few examples, we have the burning of the Library of Alexandria, the expunging of the Armenian genocide, the iconoclasm in the Byzantine Empire, the Cultural Revolution in China, the Native American re-education camps, as well as the Soviet Union's historical revision of Tartaria, which is what we're about to get into today. So please try to keep an open mind when considering the evidence I'm about to put forth. What specific evidence backs this theory? Our theory, just to be clear, is that Tartaria was not actually a region like we're told by contemporary historians, but rather an empire that had its legacy purposely diminished by the powers that eventually conquered and annexed it. Again, this is not a novel concept. This is something that we can prove has happened repeatedly throughout history. Empires get conquered, legacies get destroyed, history gets rewritten by the victors. It happens. The smoking gun of the Tartaria hypothesis in particular is the June 1957 CIA document titled National Cultural Development Under Communism. You can go online right now, go to the CIA's website, and read this document for yourself. It completely blows the lid off our contemporary narrative of this time period. This document wasn't released until August of 1999, which is over 50 years from the date it was written. And I want to quote from it right now because it is so powerful. It reads, On August 19, 1944, the Central Committee of the Communist Party, sitting in Moscow, issued a directive ordering the party's Tartar Provincial Committee to proceed to a scientific revision of the history of Tartaria, to liquidate serious shortcomings and mistakes of a nationalistic character committed by individual writers and historians in dealing with Tartar history. In other words, Tartar history was to be rewritten. Let us be frank, was to be falsified in order to eliminate references to the Great Russian aggressions and to hide the facts of the real course of Tartar-Russian relations. And this was no isolated case. In every Muslim area within the USSR, historians, on orders of the Communist Party, have rewritten history to distort the facts so that the Russians appear always in a good light. Needless to say, histories which present the facts truthfully have been withdrawn or destroyed, so that the present and future generations of Muslims are forever denied the chance of learning the true facts of their nation's past. When I first read this document, I nearly fell out of my chair. Our government hid this document for over 50 years because it proves, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that the history of Tartaria has been falsified and rewritten. And the fact that this effort to destroy Tartarian history was still going on in 1944 during World War II is very telling to me. Over 500 years after the so-called Golden Horde was conquered and Russia was finally freed of the Mongol yoke, our rulers still felt so threatened by the legacy of this civilization that they went around from province to province in Russia, systematically destroying it all. And this document is proof that this actually occurred. We have hundreds of books and writings also from the 15th to 18th century, referring to the Tartarian Empire, describing how they practiced, quote, mystic arts, and had conflict with the Papal State as well as other Christian nations. That's John Frampton, 1580. I've got the article right here in front of me. You can go to the Internet Archives right now, search for the Tartarian Empire, and you will find hundreds of references about the Tartar Muslims, how they elected kings, as well as the empire's alliance with the Ottoman Empire under the Ilkhanate. This really happened. And all of it came to a head with Tartaria's standoff with the Russians at Ugar River in 1480, as we were discussing earlier. Mainstream historians even tell us that this standoff was between the forces of Amin Khan, who 300 years later was still a direct descendant of Genghis Khan, versus the forces of Ivan III of Russia, who at this time held a loose alliance with the Papacy and was married to a niece of the last Byzantine emperor. The Ugar River standoff led to the retreat of the so-called Golden Horde from Moscow, and the Russians annexed it for good this time. Now, let's just think about this critically for a moment. We are told that the Mongol Horde took Moscow in 1238. So for almost 250 years, longer than the US has been a nation essentially, the Tartarians held control of the city. Now, if you were Ivan III in the 15th century with your powerful army and all your strategic connections to the Byzantines and the Holy Roman Empire, how could you have possibly not been able to take back your capital city from a handful of disorganized barbarian tribes? There is clearly something missing from the story here, and what's missing is that the Russians were not up against barbarians at all. They were up against an empire, or at the very least, a sophisticated military force. That is the only logical conclusion we can draw here, because how else would the Tartarians have been able to hold Moscow for 250 years? How else would they have been able to hold China until 1368? How else would they have been able to hold Iraq and Iran until the mid-14th century? For hundreds of years, this empire held enormous swaths of territory throughout Eurasia and the Middle East, and we're being told that they were nothing more than marauders with no central unity or identity. This cannot be true. By the way, you know what the oldest building in Moscow is? It's the Kremlin's Church of the Deposition of the Robe, which is supposedly built in 1484. This is interesting to me because this date is only 4 years after the Ugar River standoff. So what they're essentially trying to tell us is that none of the current buildings in Moscow existed before the Russians reconquered it in 1480, and then it was the Russians who built all these awesome buildings and cathedrals we see in Moscow today. Not the Tartarians, of course, they were just barbarians who lived in tents and yurts. In my opinion, many of these buildings may have already been there in the first place, and the reason I suggest this is because we know back then, when empires conquered and annexed territory like this, they would oftentimes kill all the people, burn all the books, and then take credit for the achievements of this previous society. And before the internet, it was a lot harder to hold societies accountable for this kind of behavior. Not to mention, many sections of the Great Wall of China are actually inside out, with their defensive fortifications facing inwards towards China rather than outwards towards the Mongols. Why would this be? Perhaps the Great Wall of China was contested at one point. Maybe at one point it was actually the Great Wall of Tartaria. And I'm not saying the Tartarians were saints either, because in my opinion, they probably weren't. All societies have problems. I don't think Tartaria was this kind of global utopia like some of my colleagues suggest, but it does go to show you just how powerful the civilization must have been, that over half a millennia after its downfall, the echoes of its legacy remained so strong that our ruling class was still trying to cover it up. We have numerous flag charts showing the Tartarian symbol as a black dragon with a curly tail, which is clearly depicted as being slain in the St. George and the Dragon emblem, which we find all across Europe and in particular on the Russian imperial flag. Also, do you remember that hidden mural posted on Reddit in 2022? The one that hadn't seen daylight since it was estimated the 1500s? Well, it was St. George and the Dragon, which kind of makes sense now why they hid it, doesn't it? We also have countless maps and globes depicting Tartaria as a vast empire as well. And one other thing I want to emphasize is that the Tartarians were widely Muslim. This is well documented, and I think, yes, this is part of the reason why we see so much spiritual conflict in the Middle East today. When you rob an entire ethnic group of their history and national origins, what do you expect to have happen? You think they'll just roll over to you forever? No, they're going to be confused and they're going to be angry. So we have a preponderance of evidence to say, almost definitively, in my opinion, that the Golden Horde was not really a horde at all. They were a sophisticated nation and military force whose legacy has been intentionally obscured by the prevailing powers. With that being said, now we need to ask the big question, why? Why would the prevailing powers do such a thing? Generally speaking, throughout history, prevailing powers have often attempted to obscure or alter historical records and narratives for various reasons, including consolidating control, shaping public opinion, and erasing undesirable elements from collective memory. But why the Tartarians in particular? Why did the Christian empires spend a millennia trying to defeat this nation, only to completely rewrite and erase their legacy? Now, I'm not going to get into that speculation today. I need to do more research, quite honestly, in this respect, but I'd like to hear from you all in the comment section below on why you all think this cover-up took place. In the past, I've heard rumblings about the Romanov family, Catherine the Great, the Freemasons, Napoleon, but I quite honestly need to do more research on this matter before I start speaking on it. But it's pretty clear to me at this point that there has been a reset of some kind, and there has been a deliberate attempt to diminish the Tartarian legacy. Personally, I think it has to do with resonant frequencies and sacred geometry, the high technology of our ancestors that I believe has been rediscovered in our era, but has been purposely suppressed by the powers that be. But we'll get more into that in the next video. Thanks for watching, everyone. Subscribe for more, and God bless.